Welcome back, everyone. Are you okay at the back? Can you hear me at the back? Fantastic. I'm always envious of teams that come with large numbers of contingents. The Nemos, the New Aventers, the Oxford team. I seem to operate as a one-man team. Well, here we are. The title is actually quite misleading, a new initiative. We haven't initiated the initiative yet. I thought that what we should do is to pose a series of questions about areas of fetal heart rate monitoring, which our current tools appear to be blindsided to. And the reason I think that is important is because it's a more responsible way of approaching what is fairly a very complex and very messy subject. I firmly believe that if the people that introduced CTG actually sat down together like this and discussed the CTG as a tool, we might have ended up with a totally different tool than what we have today. So I think the group should be proud of itself for assembling this variety of expertise, knowledge, and interest in walking through how we should progress with fetal monitoring going forward. So my real aim is to sort of open up an arena of fetal monitoring that is very important, but also seem to be sort of operating at the peripheries. And the sooner we recognize their importance and inculcate them into development of systems for monitoring in the future, the better. So I think there are missing links. We know that the rates of neurologic deficits and damage at best remain static, despite escalating interventions. All our efforts to rescue these babies, to reduce the risk of long-term neurologic damage, motor deficit, cerebral palsy, we don't seem to have dented the prevalence of cerebral palsy. And it doesn't matter which data set you look at or which region of the world you look at. And some of that may be because our current tools seem to be focused more on detection of hypoxia, as though hypoxia is the only pathway for neurologic injury. Physiology and pathology teaches us differently. It was Rick that posed a question in the morning which caught my attention. Whether some of these mechanisms of fetal damage, are they actually amenable via the current intra-pattern fetal monitoring strategies like fetal heart rate? Why is it that we believe that all damages operate through changes in the fetal heart rate? It's such a casual assumption, but it dominates our practice, it dominates our guidelines. So my real challenge to the group is whether, as a community, we can look at this in a bit more detail and empower ourselves to try and move this agenda forward in a better and more constructive way. I will draw your attention to this sort of bullet point here. Again, to make the point that hypoxia is not the only cause of fetal damage. As a matter of fact, hypoxia numerically is in the minority in terms of causation of neurologic damage during labor. And I mean hypoxia that developed during labor. Babies may be hypoxic or hypoxemic and then come into labor with it. But actually, hypoxia that developed during labor leading to fetal damage is in the minority. I've got a long list of fairly complex disease states here. So that's fetal systemic inflammatory response syndrome. This is associated with neurologic damage, not just because of the effect of the inflammatory mediators, but also this condition primes babies to damage even by minute degrees of additional hypoxic insult. Babies that are born to women that run temperature in labor are at an excess risk of neurologic seizures. And it doesn't matter how mom developed temperature, whether it's by infection, epidural, ambient temperature, drug reaction, their babies are at huge risk. Prolonged rupture of membranes, particularly in the lung, if it's of long duration, those babies are at risk of neurologic damage. Histologic chorioamnionitis, phenicitis, the histologic marker of fetal inflammatory response, fetal strokes, chromosomal abnormality. The list goes on and on and on. The big point is, collectively, these conditions contribute far more to fetal damage. But even more importantly, there are no known fetal heart rate patterns that are consistent for these conditions. So I've made 2 points. One, numerically, these conditions will collectively cause more damage in babies. But even more importantly, the tools we have to monitor babies in labor are completely blindsided to this condition. So we should be scared of them and not just focus our attention on hypoxia and tools that are designed and targeted to monitor just hypoxia. This is from an old study looking at the prevalence of cerebral palsy per 1,000 live births over a 30-year period. This graph is truncated 20 years ago. However, even if you extended it to 2022, the pattern is exactly the same. In other words, the prevalence of cerebral palsy per 1,000 live births is still hovering between 2 to 2.5 per 1,000 live births, and that hasn't changed. But look at what has happened to operative interventions in developed countries. Okay? Someone already mentioned that in the United States today, cesarean section rate is hovering around 31–32%. In the UK, it's just under 28% nationally. If you were in Greece, it's 42. In Italy, it is 40 national. If you were in Brazil, it would be 55 in public hospitals, 85 in private hospitals. In other words, you only get to have a vaginal delivery if you didn't manage to make it into the hospital. That is just not sustainable. This is data from Jeff Phelan. This study is an old one, but it makes a critical point. And that point is this, that in a subset of 300 babies, or 300 brain damaged children, in the National Registry of Brain Damage, Jeff went back and looked at their CTGs. And what is remarkable in his finding is that just over half of brain damaged children will be admitted in labor with normal looking CTG. Think about it. More than half of children damaged will be admitted in labor with normal looking CTG. And in that group, just under 10% of them, the CTG will remain normal until the babies are born. In other words, there are a group of babies that are already damaged, and we manage them as though they are normal babies, and end up adding to the problems they have because of additional challenges that we impose by letting their mom labor. How do we as a community have any insight into these babies and protect them from the process of labor? About 45% will be admitted with non-reactive CTGs. Now, if you go back to the ones that were admitted with normal-looking CTG, a large proportion of them will decompensate via patterns that we recognize either as Ed-Horn pattern, in other words, slowly evolving hypoxia, or bradycardia, unclassified there, and persistent decelerations, in other words, repetitive complex variable decelerations. But it just tells us actually that monitoring the fetal heart rate, the way we currently practice it and the way our guidelines are configured, misses the big point. But everybody goes around thinking that, we got it right. In fact, we advise the lawyers that we got it right. I know for sure they don't teach CTG monitoring in law schools. So everything the lawyers know, we told them, even though we didn't know what we were talking about. So it brings me here to this point about what actually is a normal CTG? What does it mean? What's a normal CTG? When can you classify a CTG as normal? And this is my take on it. And this is not how the guidelines see it. But a normal CTG should have a stable baseline fetal heart rate without significant decelerations. And I say that because a large number of decelerations can be totally normal. Decelerations, by their very nature, actually reflex cardiovascular responses. A normal CTG should have periods of reduced variability, which alternate with periods of increased variability, the so-called fetal cycling behavior. In other words, what it's actually describing is a behavioral state of normal term and near-term fetuses. And it's characterized by alternating sequences of increased fetal heart rate variability, followed by reduced variability, and then increased again, and then reduced again, and then increased again. The turnaround time at term and near term is somewhere between 15 minutes and about 40 minutes. Now, if a baby is doing that, in other words, passes the test for a normal CTG, such a baby is unlikely to have hypoxia, hypoxemia, or acidosis, acidemia. Such a baby is likely to have neurologic integrity and cardiovascular system integrity. Otherwise, it will be difficult to generate a normal CTG. Those babies have very low risk of intrapartum asphyxiation, unless, of course, if they encounter unpreventable and unpredictable obstetric catastrophes like cord prolapse, major abruption, or uterine rupture. So you can draw some good conclusions from a normal CTG. And I think this is where the debate has to get back to this admission test, because it is an important point. The literature around admissions CTG and the narrative, if anything, has been politicized. The facts are somewhat different. Now, what then happens if you have an abnormal CTG upstream? What kind of conclusions can you draw? If your CTG near the beginning of labor on admission is completely abnormal, or even marginally abnormal, you've got to be thinking about this differential diagnosis. Okay? Now, for those of us who are in clinical practice, if you look in our guidelines, the definition of an abnormal CTG is weak and wobbly. And I think part of the reason is because these babies present at different time points after an insult. So they've had time to either recover, modify their CTGs, or even normalize their CTGs. And I don't think our current practice guidelines actually keep pace with that sort of adaptation. So for example, fetal heart rate of 160 or more is only relevant if the insult to the baby is within the last 72 hours at most. So if a baby survives an asphyxiating insult intrauterine and comes into labor, say a week or two, you're not going to find fetal heart rate tachycardia. The heart rate would have normalized. Therefore, you miss that point. You only get decelerations with contractions if and only if that baby is at least hypoxemic. So if the baby has recovered metabolically and survived the original insult, you don't see decelerations. But the neurologic injury is still there. It's equivalent of perhaps you ran from the hotel to this lecture room, slipped and sprained your ankle. When you get here, you'll be tachycardic, you'll be tachypneic. 15-20 minutes, your heart rate will settle and your breathing will settle, but your ankle will still be hurting. It's exactly the same thing. So we admit these babies, looking for these signs and symptoms, when in actual fact, they've passed that stage and we're dealing with a completely different issue. So my question to the community is, do we have ways, be it mathematical, technical, computer, data science, that allow us to key into these parameters and be able to draw better conclusions than the ones we currently draw? If you take fetal heart rate variability, it's exactly the same thing. Your fetal heart rate variability reflects the time interval that has happened between the actual insult and the time of presentation. So, these conditions do not have specific fetal heart rate patterns. You cannot say, oh, this is what a mom that is exposed to recreational drug, her CTG is going to look like, or compared to one that has had meconium aspiration syndrome or chronic hypoxia. They look exactly the same. But the reason this is important is, if we fail to recognize these states, what it means is those babies whose insults and whose injuries are still evolving will be missed. If anything, we will exacerbate the injury by putting them through labor. Whereas, if the injury is still evolving and we recognize the abnormality, you could deliver those babies, hand them over to the pediatricians, and by process of therapeutic cooling, you may actually limit the extent of injury or even reverse it. So there's an important point with this. This is an 8-year analysis of our own data in my own institution, truncated in 2013, so almost 10 years ago. And we looked at 10 babies, 10 defined as 36 completed weeks or more. Women who were in spontaneous labor or induced labor, we excluded congenital anomalies, and over that time period we delivered just under 40,000 babies. Just under 14,000 of them were monitored using CTG and ECG. And we found 65 neonatal encephalopathies. And the way we approach CTG monitoring is we define CTG abnormality if and only if baby is tachycardic associated with reduced variability or bradycardic associated with reduced variability. You can almost crystallize intrapartum fetal heart rate monitoring from a normal CTG to this key statement as far as I'm concerned. And this is how we defined abnormal CTG. So if you ask the question, what is the incidence of metabolic acidosis in those 65 neonatal encephalopathies? And we define metabolic acidosis as pH less than 7.05 and base excess in excess of -12. So they will be here, pH less than 7.05, base excess greater than 12. Only one baby. In other words, if you get good at CTG monitoring, you can almost eliminate intrapartum metabolic acidosis. The question is, where are the other 64 neonatal encephalopathies coming from? What's driving those? And that's what we're blindsided to. So intrapartum metabolic acidosis leading to cerebral palsy, at least in my institution, is a rare event. But we're not escaping metabolic acid, the neonatal encephalopathies. The key question is, where are these, what are driving these changes? So I just shared 2 examples. Don't worry about these artifacts here. This lady was admitted to labor ward, and if you note the time here, that's about 10:30. Okay? This is her initial CTG. Then, sorry? 10:50. No, 10:30. This is where I was pointing. Is it 10:50? Oh yeah. You have 10 minutes. Yeah. Your eyes are better than mine. And that's understandable.
I've got contacts.
Yeah, you're cheating.
Yeah.
So that's 10:50. That's 11. But the key point is, this baseline rate is within normal range. The variability is normal. You could almost make a case for acceleration there. Now follow this CTG forward. Normal baseline, normal variability, no decelerations. So if you fit this into any regulatory guidelines, you're going to get a normal CTG. Okay? What is missing here is this CTG is completely monotonous. Normal term healthy near-term babies don't do that. They go through these intervening sequences of increased variability, reduced variability, increased variability, reduced variability. But if you plug this CTG in any of our guidelines, it will pass. Fantastic, no problem. So the team here carried on managing this baby. And the other thing you might notice is the variability starts to increase, not because the baby is recovering, but because he's experiencing additional new onset stressor, this time escalating labor. Okay? 6 centimeters, they carried on, and then deceleration starts to appear. In other words, the baby is finding the process of labor more challenging and developing hypoxemia. Okay, they carried on. The doctors got fed up because of this, which they couldn't explain. Took her to theater and delivered her. And this is the outcome: very low abgas, depressed acid-base status, HIE grade 2, meconium aspiration. It wouldn't have mattered if the team delivered this baby within 15-20 minutes of admission. You're not going to change this outcome, but you will not have subjected this baby to the potential of collapse during labor and then incurring additional injury. Here's another one. 22-year-old woman, 2 babies by cesarean section. Normal antenatal care, booked for elective section at 39 weeks. But a few days before 39 weeks, she comes in spontaneous labor, 7 centimeters dilated, but was adamant she must have her cesarean section. Okay, so a decision was made to do the cesarean section. This is her CTG. And again, if you look, that is a normal looking CTG. Good baseline, normal variability, no decelerations. Okay, and they carried on monitoring. Again, good variability, normal baseline, no deceleration. The one thing this baby is not doing is showing you that repetitive cycles of alternating sequences, reduced variability, increased variability. So even when the variability looks nice and normal, but it's not cycling, that is not a normal baby. And it feeds back to Rick's earlier point, that actually looking for absence of normality in itself is important, and that's what this case tells us. So the team carried on monitoring, and then eventually went to theater to deliver the baby. They found very minimum amniotic fluid. The delivery at cesarean was very difficult because the baby had already descended in the breast canal. They tried forceps 3 times, they couldn't lock it. They extended the incision, and the incision on the uterus ended up to be an inverted T. The baby was born really, really bruised. This is a comment by the pediatrician, and the baby was jittery. The abgas were normal, okay? And the baby was good weight. However, at 8 months, the baby won't sit up. 11 months, won't use the right hand, and was referred to the pediatrician. And a diagnosis of a stroke affecting the left cerebral hemisphere was made. But this was an antenatal stroke. It had nothing to do with the delivery, nothing to do with the labor. Again, suggesting that many of these babies that we admit already have problems with them. These parents litigated because everybody concluded that because it took about 15 minutes to deliver the baby with all the trauma and all the things that went on, that's when the brain damage occurred. No, but the radiological evidence was that this was an antenatal stroke. Okay, some of you may, if you practice in the UK, would have come across this. So this is the each baby count quality initiative by the Royal College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. And what the RCOG set out to do was actually document the number of babies that either died during labor or sustained brain damage during labor. And in the first report, there was 1,280 something babies. But the point of this slide is to draw your attention to the key themes, the top 5 key themes that contributed to those adverse outcomes. And they included lack of training and education amongst obstetricians and midwives. Individual human factors, people that won't get out of bed, for example, or get out of bed but take too long to wake up properly. CTG interpretation and fetal blood sampling. Risk recognition, team communication. And within this Venn diagram, what they've done is to sort of plug the number of babies that overlapped across these themes. This is actually the good news. The bad news is here, that if you take the themes in and of themselves and plot the individual babies and how these interacting complexities overlap across the population of damaged babies, you end up with something like 3,800 interrelationships. What that tells me is intrapartum fetal monitoring is a deeply, deeply complex enterprise. There's no quick fix, so we should be looking for complex solutions rather than thinking once we roll out these, nice-looking, straightforward, sort of magic bullet guidance, that is it. That's not quite what happens in real life. It's exceedingly complex with so many overlapping themes and layers of complexities. And unless we recognize...
Probably battery died. Try the other one.
And unless we recognize those complexities, we're very unlikely to get to the roots of these problems. Now, some of you may remember the infant trial. We had a similar trial, but a smaller trial going on at St. George's Hospital at the time of the infant trial. But the hypothesis between the two trials are actually the same things. We're both testing computer algorithms. And the key hypothesis by infant and our trial was a substantial proportion of substandard care results from failure to correctly identify abnormal fetal heart rate patterns. Just think about it. We're too stupid to see and identify abnormal fetal heart rate patterns. And that if you improve recognition and identification, then you will reduce substandard care and also reduce unnecessary intervention. Not true. We did not, because even when the computer told us in over 90% of cases that there is a problem, we still provided substandard care in nearly 80% of cases. So the problem actually is not necessarily identifying the presence of abnormality. The computer has done that and handed it over to the clinicians. What did we do with the information? So for those of us who are technically trained and technically minded, looking for solutions to these problems, even when you give us the best tool, put it between our eyes, hang on, there's abnormality, go and sort it out, we still do not sort out the problem in over 80% of cases. So we've got to have a more imaginative, a more nuanced approach to this problem. So the problem is not really failure to recognize abnormality, because that's been taken out of our hands and done for us by the computer. But we fail to act appropriately, either because we haven't taken note or cognizance of the context of the clinical problem, or we don't follow our weak guidelines even as they currently stand, or we just do not act quickly enough. But it has nothing to do with recognition. All the training modules, all the drills that go on, even deployment of computer support algorithms do not actually change the outcome. So we, as practitioners, we have a role to play in this. And one example I wanted to share with you is chorioamnionitis. So this is a situation where infection has ascended into the intrauterine environment via the vagina, through the cervix, breach the physical mucous plug, and affect the baby. Now this baby doesn't know that this amniotic fluid is infected, so he or she swallows and inhales the contaminated amniotic fluid and all the inflammatory mediators within the amniotic fluid. And because of poorly developed gap junctions, these organisms will have access to the baby's systemic circulation. So it ends up with that nasty condition of fetal systemic inflammatory response. And what you have here is the range of organs that suffer the impact of that process. Now that's not surprising, because fetal sepsis or fetal host response is an endothelial disease, and everywhere you have blood vessels, you'll have that response. So those babies will be born with higher risk of necrotizing enterocolitis, for example, intracranial hemorrhage, skin disorders, kidney disorders, respiratory failure, name it. Almost every organ in the body is affected. As clinicians, what do? When we monitor these babies in labor, we tend to ignore the fact that this is infection, inflammation, and we try to risk profile these babies by doing fetal blood sample. This slide here is to show you that there is absolutely no difference between the acid-base status in babies that are infected compared to their non-infected peers. Okay? However, if you ask the question, what is the APGAR scores, both at 1 minute and at 5 minutes, you begin to find significant differences between babies that are infected and their non-infected controls. So everything breaks down to this complex diagram here, which Antoniya and I have been playing with for many years. Is it many years?
It is pretty
Yeah.
much, yeah.
Yeah.
I'm old too, no.
Yes, I don't have monopoly of being old.
You don't.
So, what are the different pathways to injury? Okay. So far, I think a lot of our approaches has been dedicated on hypoxia and hypoxia-mediated processes, but it's bigger than that. During labor, if babies develop acidemia or deplete their myocardial glycogen because they haven't stored enough, yes, they are at risk of hypotension, with compromise of cerebral blood flow, and therefore risk of hypoxic systemic encephalopathy. Infection we've seen, okay, babies can have fetal placental hemorrhage. We're in danger of thinking that all of these pathways can be captured on a CTG. If I draw your attention to this side of the slide, glucose and other metabolic disorders, particularly the ones that impair the development of the placenta, actually contribute to processing leading to fetal damage. But we totally ignore all of those. We don't even think about that. We have no sort of input or access. How can we, what sort of data set will allow us to pull out what is going on in these places to be able to manage these babies much better than we're currently doing. Okay, and this is data from Alistair Gunn, the group, the New Zealand group, stating clearly that there's a relationship between fetal hypotension and neurologic damage. So if you don't subject a baby, at least via the hypoxia pathway, or a baby is exposed to factors that undermine his or her ability to maintain central pressures, those babies are at risk of either neurologic damage or death. So there is an inverse correlation between the baby's ability to maintain his or her blood pressure and the risk of death. Okay? So if a baby, for example, is confronted with intrapartum stressor and need to adapt to that, but cannot do so, and loses that pressure, the risk of death just escalates. So to finish off, I think there are gaps in our knowledge, and I think there are missing links, which in the process of developing better ways of monitoring babies, this is the time to include that, or at least think about it, or calibrate the processes or endpoints that we're throwing out in a way that recognizes that we don't have all the answers just yet. So there's more to fetal monitoring than just the fetal heart rate. Our current tools don't look at non-hypoxia pathways, and that's a weakness. So let's not repeat that weakness going forward. So my challenge to the community is we need to look very carefully. We must try not to forget that these aspects of the process does exist. So I'm afraid I've got more questions rather than answers, but thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Austin, for throwing us in the deep again. It's a great closure for today before we go sightseeing. Any comments, questions, thoughts? I know we're very late. Martin?
Would more data help?
I've no idea. I'm not a data scientist. Where's Martin? Yeah, there he is.
Yeah, you've been very quiet today. I feel, can you just, what's wrong with you? I was quiet on purpose, but why are you quiet?
I want to thank you for the wonderful talk. I think it's so important to keep the focus on this. I would like to ask for your thoughts on what already has been sort of alluded to, right? So we need the we need the admission assessment CTGs, but really what seemed to me the unspoken thing was what you're also pointing out. Well, it's obviously something that antecedents are there maybe a month before, maybe 2 months before, potentially other influences from the mom. So all these need to be somehow accounted for. What is your vision when you're thinking what should be there to start addressing this?
I have to say, I look ahead with a lot of trepidation, not least because there isn't enough conversation and enough of this forum around. Most of us in clinical, in fact, many of us, all of us in clinical practice were, mad and misguided. The only difference is some of us realize that, but many people do not, and that worries me. And then there's the issue of resources. There's the issue of pressure from litigation. So it makes the development of new ways of doing things, better ways of doing old things. It makes it very difficult. And there can be no better example than the field that we're trying to optimize. One key question that was raised once is we don't actually know when the fetal brain takes over control of the fetal heart rate. So if we're expecting fetal heart rate patterns to sort of pick up injuries that predate that event, we're wasting our time.
Yeah, I'm just afraid if others feel hostages, so maybe, and then better, just more concise.
Yes,
then we continue ourselves in the outside.
Maybe if okay, just one.
Yeah, then better. Yeah.
You carry on, I'll try and scream.
I have been kind of, walking between industry and academia for the last 5+ years increasingly, and what I hear is that, cycle where you say, oh, this algorithm can help you pick up something, and then, oh, but we will be sued before we can act. And so this appears to be so disenchanting, to say the least, where basically the fear of lawsuits, and it's not just in obstetrics. Obstetrics is the poster child, unfortunately. Nobody is so on top of it as obstetrics in terms of the numbers, but it's more like a bull really in other areas too. So it almost screams for inclusion of legal system or jurisdiction to say, hey, we have a crisis. I mean, like you've shown, right? Like we're completely failing to innovate in this for decades. There has to be like some sort of a protection where it says this is a crisis, kind of like emergency use authorization for COVID.
Yes.
Does it take this and say, okay, these innovations, the institutions, the hospitals that choose to participate in testing of these technologies should be literally legally exempt. I don't know, I'm not a lawyer. From being sued. Something like that. Like it's just like something that I see that so much. I say that cannot be. We will never get past that if you always hear that as a company or as a
You need state actors. No, please pass. I'll try and speak loud. You need the state to intervene to redress that problem. It is not accidental that even after 50, 60 years, fetal heart rate monitoring hasn't actually changed. The machines look better, some of them are interactive, but we're still counting RR intervals. It hasn't changed fundamentally. It's not accidental.
I have a quick question. Given your first bullet and given the existing technologies, what kind of signals would you acquire to monitor fetuses?
I have absolutely no idea. But at least I know that gap exists in our current knowledge. As I've just said, we're still counting the fetal heart rate, but there are characteristic features within that heart rate dynamic. What are they? Can they help? Will they give us more information? I don't know. I am not I'm not technically knowledgeable enough to sort of address that point, but it is an important point. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the fetal heart rate monitoring started roughly at the same time as President Kennedy challenged NASA to put man on the moon and bring him at the same time. You can see the difference. I think there's another comment.
Was there one last Professor Kirk?
Yeah, Jerry.
I want to thank you for the talk. One rediscovers the perspective of and the difficulties of practicing obstetrics. I'm from New York. I'm in the United States. In New York, there are more lawyers than rats. And no, the government, Western liberal democratic governments are not going to change tort law. There's a long tradition in tort law, and there are a lot of lawyers that will spend a lot of money to buy the right members of Parliament or Congress. So we have to continue with efforts to unravel this conundrum, and it is a conundrum. Are we going to make neurologically impaired babies a thing of the past? No, because there are other factors, as you pointed out, chromosomes. They're just genetics, local environments. But that's not a reason to give up or quit. It's not a reason to stop trying to improve those two lines that are drawn on the paper. There just needs to be more biological science behind them. We need to use the tools of deep learning and continue to stumble around in the dark until we find something that works.
That's very optimistic, Jerry.
I'm going to conclude this excellent session with one comment, bringing us back to the excellent presentations from transabdominal monitoring in particular. That is one avenue. It's not the only one, but that's one avenue. And when we talk about co-monitoring, there's also Blue Light for showing it generally. I think that's one avenue as well. When we start collecting high quality, high intensity data, because heart rate, but our technology is just, we're at 4 Hertz, autocorrelated, short intervals, noisy gaps and everything. So, that's, some people really believe in that, the ECG data in the large scale. So, yeah, it's my last comment as well. Stay tuned for Saturday maybe, because, that can set us up for how we monitor during labor if we have individual information for that fetus, for that lady throughout that pregnancy or in the weeks before labor, that who knows, in a high dimensional, in a better resolution. We don't know. So thank you very much. Sightseeing is at